Borada, good morning. It's very nice to be joining you, although unfortunately only virtually. I hope to be with you in Cardiff this morning, but as you can see, I am sitting in the Isle of Skye to Ellenskienach. So my original intention with this keynote was to make it a little bit interactive, because I think when we're talking about artificial intelligence, we're talking about a lot of conjecture, a lot of hype, and a lot of don't knows. It's very much an emerging topic. That's going to be difficult to do via recording, so what I'll try and do is run through what I think some of the main points and the main issues are that we need to consider in terms of society, parliaments, and particularly researchers working in parliaments. So let's start with a little bit of context. And the first thing to say, I think, is that there is nothing new about AI. We're using this AI term a lot at the moment, but it really goes back to the 1950s, and it goes back to the early computer systems that were very much question and answer, and we think of the frequently asked questions. A more advanced version of that is AI. Back in the 1980s, we were developing machine learning systems, and we're developing systems that banks have been using for years that are able to use algorithm-based systems to make decisions. So nothing new about that at all. Where we've moved and where we're really talking today is the large language models and generative AI of ChatGPT and the things like that we're seeing. So we're talking about a very specific niche area, but rapidly emerging area of AI. So we're going to refer to it as that, and we will refer to it as that, but what we're really talking about is generative AI today, and that is the ability of a intelligent, shall we say, computer software product to create something new, to generate a new object or content. And we're talking about it in all sorts of contexts in our life at the moment: virtual assistants, translation, content creation, improving search engine accuracy, or actually more often than not what it's doing is scraping search engines to produce cohesive packages of new content based on the results of that. We're using it for customer service, for healthcare, in education. We can use it in writing. We can use it, actually, I mean, it's a really useful writing tool, being able to get AI to look at what you're writing and improve the grammar, albeit I think if you've ever tried it, you know it doesn't always succeed. And also in terms of generating news and media. So we can use it for creating news stories, or we can use it for summarizing what's going on. And of course, we can use it in research. But the key challenge we have today, I guess there's two key challenges. One is the speed of change, because this is hitting us very fast and very rapidly developing. And the other is, how do we manage that? How do we manage change? And that is on a number of levels, institutionally, societally, from a regulatory point of view, or a governance point of view. In terms of that speed of change, someone at the European Parliament was telling me this week that they're seeing a new AI pilot every 4 months, and that the pace of those pilots is accelerating. So this is really hitting us in our day-to-day business very, very quickly. And we don't have the regulations in place specifically to deal with AI. Although a lot of the regulations we need, we'll probably find, like in most areas of digital, existing regulation actually is able to cope with a lot of the circumstances, who knows, 80–90%. But there are some specifics about AI that we need to think about. So we need to think about regulation and governance. And we need to think about the impact on cybersecurity. These smart thinking systems, what do they do for our security in terms of networks as well as individuals? If we're using these systems, or we're receivers of content created by these systems, what's the impact for that on our digital literacy and critical thinking? We're going to have to become able to figure out if what we're seeing is real or computer generated. I saw someone on Twitter, which I'm going to still insist on calling it, the other day, saying that they just had a phone interview with someone and they swore blind that this person was using ChatGPT to answer the questions, just because of the nature of the questions. And it makes you think, doesn't it? Where are these answers coming from? And if we're going to have AI, which we are, what are the ethics behind the use of it and the collection of resources? There's emerging stories at the moment about the sort of sweatshops being used to build these large language models in underdeveloped countries, and what are the ethical practices behind that? There's also ethical considerations in terms of where does that content come from? What are the implications for copyright and fair use? And of course, for how we use it. So we have to consider all of that. And AI is not neutral. Anything generating artificially created content is not neutral. It has come from somewhere. The content has come from somewhere. The algorithm has been written by someone. Yes, it may be self-referential and self-learning, but that, as we'll maybe talk about in a little bit, is a problem in itself. So we have to think about, when we're talking about algorithmic artificial intelligence, how does it operate? Who gets to write that algorithm? What's the confirmation bias in it? Is there a confirmation bias, or is it open to new ideas? You know, we all suffer from confirmation bias. As researchers, we're probably more acutely aware of that than anybody else, but we have to think about it in terms of systems and the people building those systems and how they are approaching the question of bias and source material and legitimacy of the source material as well. So is there a negative legacy in using AI that the source material it's built on is bad, is biased, is too one-sided, it's not presenting enough of an argument? Is it also too monocultural? Are we losing a lot of cultural and societal nuances by building on a corpus of digital information that is very much monocultural? And this is all a problem at the moment because we have a complete lack of oversight. We have no idea really what is going into these models. They'll tell us some of it, but not enough. And there is no, you know, we can't open the bonnet and have a look at the moment. There's no inspection, no audit. So this brings with it some negative risks, and important negative risks that we need to consider when we're thinking about how we might use artificial intelligence in our work. There are unintended consequences, included unintended biases coming from source material. There's the risk of disinformation, and this can be from the deep fake, it's just fake and intentionally fake, and if that's feeding into the large language model, what are the implications there? But also, if any of you have used tools like ChatGPT or Bard, you'll know that they're actually not that good. So as an example, I asked ChatGPT to tell me what the benefit to parliaments of our World e-Parliament report are. I thought, that's a nice thing. I'd like to know, what does the world think? And it told me lots of very nice things. It actually wrote some very good text. So I have to admit, some of which we will use. But it also told me that it was a biannual report, which, as the author of it, made me slightly nervous because I really don't want to be writing 2 a year, and it is in fact a biennial report. Now that's a very small mistake, and someone somewhere has obviously made that mistake in something somewhere on the internet, and I can't find where. I can't find where it's taken that fact from, but it's not a fact, it's wrong. And a very trivial example, but these things compound. There are also examples of academic papers or journalistic articles that have been completely made up by ChatGPT. I have a colleague in academia who had an email asking about a paper, and no idea what this paper was. It was just absolute fiction. And also reporting from the Guardian saying that they're getting inquiries about articles that sound entirely plausible but actually aren't real. And it's because it's compounding things and taking information and creating articles from thin air. Now, that's not great when we're looking at facts and at quality research that needs to be fully justified, and we need to be referenced and rigorously argued. It's a challenge. It's going to be a challenge for university students. It's going to be a challenge for researchers. It's a challenge for consumers of research and for journalists. So these things have to improve. And where's the fact checking in that? Where was the ability for me to go back to ChatGPT and say, hey guys, that's wrong, and it wasn't really there? Would have been a convoluted and complex path for me to fix one very tiny thing. So we need feedback mechanisms and feedback loops for this as well, because the best people to fix things are the people that actually know, and we can make the models better. So that's something that's going to develop, I'm sure, but isn't there yet in a mature way. So let's look at this legislatively. We're all in parliaments, we all like legislation. Legislation is good stuff. It sets the baseline for what we're going to do. And there's a couple of different approaches legislatively. So let's look at the EU and the US. So the EU is taking an approach based more around risk levels and formal models and quite structural. And it's looking at unacceptable risks, such as using AI for social scoring, high risks such as education or workers management, and biometric information systems, where AI scanning tools could be used for scanning employees or job applications and could be wrong. And then going down the food chain, limited risk with specific transparency obligations, and then minimal risk such as spam filters. Who cares if that email went into the wrong folder? You can pick it out and solve it. The US is taking a slightly more holistic approach to this, and they talk about developing blueprints for safe and effective systems. They talk about managing the algorithmic discrimination and having to impose on system providers of AI-based systems notices of explanation, and to have to consider human alternatives. So what are the fallbacks and failbacks for when AI goes wrong? And the example I quoted before, how do I feed that back into the system? So they also, at the US level, are asking, where are bias audits needed? And who's going to carry those out? That raises a question of, do we need some kind of certification around auditing and management of AI and people who can do that? And what are being American, they're also worried about the legal risks in terms of disclosure and impact. And what's the liability for AI errors? Who faces that liability? So there's also questions in there about what's our level of not just digital literacy, but AI literacy going forward. And it's one of those things, again, that, in 20 years' time, we may take this for granted and it will have moved on beyond our recognition. But these early days, we need to set the foundation so that we've got strong governance in place. So how do we do that? How do we regulate and manage AI? There's kind of two approaches we can take to this, and there's two approaches that are starting to emerge. And one is a top-down large-scale framework that maps out what a generic generative AI process looks like and maps out the applications of it and the controls that are needed at the different levels of application. And the other is more an emergent use case based system that's more flexible and can emerge and develop. Now, I'm not a fan of the huge framework. I think it will fail, and I think it's naive because I don't think we know enough about it. And by the time we do, it's too late. So I have a preferred approach, which is to take a more use case or rules-based approach to regulating, which is we look at the applications and we see how they all slot together. And I think that will start to become fairly clear over the next 2 to 3 years. And it can be organic. It can grow and change very easily. But we can't do this individually. Ireland cannot create legislation around AI and expect it to work on its own. The UK can't. The US can't. We need international approaches to this because otherwise the problem just moves around. And we've seen that with social media. We've had some efforts at managing the worst content of social media, and there's general agreement on it, but we still haven't done it. Even with things like the Christchurch call, we've not managed to get rid of the nasty content. And we're going to be in the same predicament with AI if we're not careful. So where do we go? And this is leading into how we actually apply it as well. If we're going to regulate AI, which we are going to, because someone somewhere is always going to do this, you have to establish some clear ethical guidelines. Where can it be used? Where can't it be used? You have to find a way of ensuring the transparency of AI, not just that something's been produced by it, but how it's been produced. And if we're talking about it in a legislative setting, so we look at Brazil, for example, the Brazilian Chamber of Deputies is using an AI-based system to help it with legislative drafting. And it's not unique, other parliaments are looking at this. But that algorithm needs to be open, because otherwise we can't guarantee that this legislation isn't being biased in some way. What if someone hacks that system and has control over the algorithm to send legislation in a particular direction? So we need transparency, we need auditability, and that needs to be enshrined in legislation, I think, because we have to have a legal right to be sure that those systems are legitimate, particularly when they're operating at a parliamentary, legislative, or even public sector level. So we need to promote international collaboration and partnerships around a global consensus on AI and around AI in the public sector and in the legislative sector. We need to make sure also more broadly that AI technologies are developed and deployed in responsible ways, and that there's some kind of risk management framework. Now, there's already a National Institute for Science and Technology AI risk management framework in the US, which is quite a useful emergent tool. And I won't go into that here because it's quite complicated and detailed, but it's addressing liability and accountability for AI technologies. And it's starting to address the question of what happens when they spread disinformation and cause harm. And of course, this is an ongoing process, so it's got to be a very dynamic, ongoing, an organic process. That AI is changing so rapidly. And then the other issue here, which is probably going to emerge fairly quickly, and although it's not a major issue in terms of AI itself, for me, it's a major issue in terms of how we will see the legal position of AI content emerge, which is copyright infringement. So if I write a paper and it's published in a journal, and a large language model sucks that in and uses it and generates content based on that paper, and it's recognizably from my paper, is that an infringement on my copyright? It's not fair use, I don't think. I don't think fair use covers that argument at all. So how are we going to manage this? And I think there's going to be a number of court cases in the very near future, there's some already emerging, which are going to try and pin down where copyright barriers are for this, and when it's a copyright issue and when it's a fair use issue. So that's something that's going to emerge. So I've covered a lot of regulation. I've talked about AI and some of the technical things behind it. Well, what does that mean for us? What does it mean for us societally, for legislatures, and for researchers? So I'm going to skip through that in the final part of my slightly abbreviated talk. So the societal impact of AI, well, it's good and bad, isn't it? We're going to see AI spread through our life in the next 5 years. It will have transformed in ways we haven't imagined, I'm quite sure. I mean, we have to be careful with this because, listening to the people who are really promoting AI at the moment is like listening to people who are promoting blockchain. It's like listening to people who are promoting the internet. It's like listening to people that were promoting the fax machine. It's the same. There's a lot of hype. There's a lot of rubbish, and in it there are some nuggets of really good stuff. And what happens will be based on any technology adoption model. If there are benefits to it, we will adopt it. And if it's just annoying and a waste of time, we won't. And if there are better ways come along, we'll replace it. Anybody still use a fax machine? In its day, fantastic. We haven't used one for years. And it's going to be the same with AI. It's going to have social benefit to be fully adopted. It won't work to impose it. Technological adoption doesn't work top down. So it'll have positive and negative changes. What's good about it? Well, it can improve convenience and efficiency. It could be used to help predict our shopping lists. That's a good idea. That'd be quite handy. Instead of scratching your head in the supermarket because you've forgotten to write the list, you can go onto your app and say, hey, what did I buy the last 5 times I was in the shop? Make me an average list of what I would typically buy. Now, it's not a particularly challenging piece of computational logic, but it requires data and information on me, my lifestyle, my cupboards, what I've bought, my shopping habits, But it would be really handy on one of those moments where I stand there in the supermarket going, I have no idea what I need to buy. So helpful. But also, there is the negative side of it, and we're already seeing this in terms of disinformation, the generation of disinformation and false news stories. We're seeing a lot of talk at the moment about job losses. You'll be replaced by a computer. Well, we've been having that discussion for 40 years, and so far we've pretty much managed. Maybe this is the one that does catch us out. Maybe this is the one that takes away the graduate level middle class jobs, which is why people are suddenly concerned. Maybe it takes away researchers' jobs. Well, it's certainly going to make a difference to them if it develops in the way it's going. But we don't know what that impact is. But we have to be aware and we have to be concerned. So it's going to transform a number of sectors. It transforms already photography and graphic design, because being able to use AI-based tools to create images and manipulate images is huge. So that's going to be one of the first changes that we see. And AI, because it's able to base decisions on lots and lots of information, is a very good predictive technology. And so that prediction is going to be used more and more. And we've already talked about the main focus being generation of content, but actually prediction of things. And that could be, I could support the sort of systems we have now in finance around mortgage decisions, credit card decisions. You think of that as the base level. It could support much more complex decisions. We're already seeing research projects where predictive AI technology is able to improve the speed of diagnosis in medical settings. Now, as a clinical tool, that could be hugely, hugely powerful. A doctor can only do so much, a laboratory can only do so much, but a big server sitting in a server room somewhere with an AI predictive model working on it is 24/7 and doesn't need a cup of tea and a biscuit. It just has the ability to keep going. So this is a really exciting development. Both the predictive and the generative models have an economic impact. We don't know what that's going to be, but it could be substantial. It could actually boost the global economy, but maybe not if people are losing jobs. So we don't know. The jury's out on that one. So where are we at the moment? If we're all back in our parliaments and thinking, how is AI happening in this parliament? Well, we're already seeing it, as I mentioned, for bill writing, but research around bills and bill writing in Argentina, in Brazil, in Finland, in Italy, in both the Chamber of Deputies and the Senate. We're seeing in Italy it being used for bill submissions and discussions around amendments and analysis of amendments. AI-based speech recognition and translation tools in Canada, Italy, Brazil, Estonia, the Netherlands, European Parliament, and Angola. So it's not just the big countries. We think about technology in parliaments, we think of the UK and Brazil and Ireland and Canada, South Africa, doing big impressive things. But there are small parliaments doing things as well. And the National Assembly of Angola is already looking at these speech recognition and translation tools. The Parliament of Norway is looking at scanning parliamentary documents to produce keywords. Brazil, in both the Chamber of Deputies and the Senate, is looking at AI-based facial recognition in the chamber and using that for voting. And the Brazilian Chamber of Deputies has a public-facing system where the public can ask questions about bills and things going through Parliament, and it uses an AI-based model to pull out information on that. So quite a lot is happening. I'd say at this stage those projects are all pretty much, if not pilots, emergent. They're all quite new. The UK, the House of Commons, UK Parliament, has been looking at guidelines in how to use AI, but not actively looking at AI-based systems. But I think that's probably going to change fairly soon. They're certainly looking at what's happening. And what does it mean for us all as researchers? It's got some real benefits, actually. If we're doing just horizon scans and topic scans, looking at things, it's really good ways of tools like Perplexity and ChatGPT underneath it are really good ways of just doing an environmental scan on a topic and getting a sense of what's going on. You've got to have the knowledge because you can't rely on it. So you need the secondary sources to back it up. But if you're trying to get your head around something, it's really, really quite good. It's much more efficient. And it can help us make sense of large amounts of data much more quickly and much more effectively. If I think back to the days when I was hand coding transcript after transcript after transcript for grounded theory, it's a tedious process where you end up with stacks of paper and post-it notes everywhere. Can you imagine just running that through an AI-based system and it saying, "Hey, there you go. Here are your themes." I think that's really useful, and it democratizes research. I don't need the same level of training to use those tools. I still need the knowledge and understanding, that information and digital literacy, to make sense of it. But making sense of that data isn't necessarily from the process. I think we lose some of that hands-on process. I'm slightly nervous about that, but it's a trade-off, isn't it? It's a pragmatic tool. And it does let us make our findings better, more accurate, more nuanced, because we can reference back to multiple sources. And it's also going to create new research opportunities and lines of inquiry, because it's able to see things in the data that we don't see, or if we do see, we don't have time to pursue. So maybe if we say, hey, that's interesting, I'll just run something in the background on that, we could be pulling out some new discoveries. So that's great. Now, of course, there's the big risk that we don't actually know what it's going to do to research-based jobs, either in Parliament or in academia or in the private sector. We just don't know. We shouldn't be trying to second guess it at the moment. I think it's dangerous to second guess too much. So what's our direction of travel? Well, it's high speed, and I think I was a radio documentary on at the weekend talking about Concorde, and one of the pilots struck me when he talked about learning to fly Concorde was you had to forget about flying a plane, because the standard aeroplane is aerodynamic and it has the ability, if you turn the engines off, it'll glide for a little bit, whereas Concorde actually is just a ballistic missile. If you turn the engines off, it drops. It's basically the engines that fire it through the sky like a missile. And that's quite a good metaphor for thinking about traditional research versus AI. Traditional research, we can glide for a little bit. We've got engines to power us, but we can glide. AI is just off. It's ballistic. It's away, and it's accelerating rapidly in front of us, and it's accelerating way ahead of where we are in terms of understanding how it's going to be used. So it's ahead of us on regulations, and we've got to think about that from a risk point of view. It's ahead of us in terms of the ethics of use and the ethics of where that data comes from. We've not really got our heads around the auditing of the input, the algorithm and the output, and we've not thought about licensing in terms of what does it produce and who owns it and where does that come from. We need to be asking questions very openly about public scrutiny and transparency, trust building, and also going back to this age-old question of we can't use digital tools unless we're digitally literate. We can't make sense of what's on those digital tools unless we're information literate. And bringing more AI-based things into our lives only increases that absolutely fundamental need for information literacy to be a basic life skill. We've got to be able to understand what we're reading, how true it is, where it comes from, be able to tell real from false. And then there's a technical layer, intellectual property, the environmental impact of running these massive servers everywhere, and what are the impacts for systems development? Systems development through AI is already a thing. We can already get AI to write code. We can already get AI to take our software code and fix it. So where's that going to go? And the answer is we don't know. But what are the roles of systems development? Again, what's the audit process in making sure that software is doing what we want and isn't being manipulated? The whole cybersecurity thing behind AI is huge and at the moment massively ignored. So there are going to be some very serious questions to ask around that. So what does it mean for us in practice? AI can answer factual questions without bias accurately. That's what we want. That's where we want to get to. It can create or manipulate coherent and plausible texts, images, and videos. And a key word in there is legitimate. This stuff is real. It's derived from solid foundations. It's not fiction that it's made up. And at some point, it needs to also become more contextually aware. So it understands that when it's answering a question in environment A, that the way it responds to that question is different than environment B. So if you're asking it on a school project, that's different to a member of parliament asking a question about something. So contextually aware responses. So that's me, that's AI. I'm not sure how much you got from this because it's such a huge subject, and I think our biggest challenge at the moment is we're not experts in this. It's too new. I'm very wary of anyone who tells me they're an expert in AI because they're not. Very, very few people really are, and then it's very niche areas. So I think we've got to have a really open mind about this, watch very carefully what's happening. But one thing we need right now today, are guidelines on what we could be using, where and when we could be using it, and how we should be using the results of it. So particularly for a research context, we need to really think about when is it okay for me to use ChatGPT to help with this answer, and when is it not? And when I do, how do I fact check it? How do I make sure what it's telling me is right? And those are my questions when I'm looking at these tools. And I think those are the principles we need to be thinking about right now in our day-to-day life. When is it okay to use this, and how do I know it's right and accurate? So with that, I'm going to leave you to have hopefully a really useful discussion around AI and parliamentary research, and enjoy the rest of your time in Cardiff. Thank you so much for your time, and again, my apologies for not being with you in person, but it was just not going to be possible today. So thank you and goodbye.